So here's a brain twister. Each year, Americans spend over $2.5 trillion on food. That's higher than the entire GDP of Canada or Brazil. And that is politically sensitive.
$14.99 for eggs?
$33 for toilet paper? We can't even afford to shit.
But the US is also a major producer. Over 80% of the food Americans consume is produced domestically, while their imports account for a much smaller share. This means that much of the food is produced, processed, and packaged in the United States, where it's subject to federal laws. Washington would therefore, in theory, have great power over how it's priced. But why do politicians struggle to bring prices down?
A vote for Trump means your groceries will be cheaper.
Beef now costs 67% more than in 2020. Chicken, 50%. Bread, 34%. As much as 1 in every 7 households is now food insecure. Why can Americans no longer afford their own food? This is America's food crisis with hindsight. So right off the bat, it is likely going to get a lot worse as the oil shock is going to hit the United States. But to fully understand why, you must look at how the system was built. If you zoom out and look beyond just farming, US agriculture becomes something much bigger. Across the entire system it supports, it is tied to nearly 50 million jobs, generating around $3 trillion in wages and driving $10 trillion in annual economic output. That works out to roughly 20% of the entire US GDP being tied to food. To put that into perspective, that is bigger than the entire economy of Germany and, well, every country's economy other than China's. Now, that is our starting point. And before we go to why food prices are so high and why they are so difficult to control, let's look at how the system actually works. During the 1930s, hunger was widespread. The economy had collapsed, unemployment rose to 25%, and 1 in every 5 Americans was undernourished. In cities, people lined up for bread and soup kitchens, while in the countryside, farmers were producing so much food that they were sometimes forced to just throw it away. That's when disaster struck.
In one black blizzard, 5 million tons of soil took to the air over Wichita, Kansas.
Severe dust storms devastated the Great Plains. Periods of sustained drought and decades of unsustainable farming practices had stripped the land of its stability. The whole system didn't work, and something had to change.
The destructive forces that were threatening American agriculture.
President Roosevelt set out to rebuild American agriculture from the ground up. Their policy goal was to ensure that Americans had stable and affordable food, storing surplus production during good years to be released when harvest failed. During World War II, mechanization accelerated. Tractors replaced manual labor, and the widespread use of fertilizers became standard. Over the years, American families noticed a major difference. In 1933, a family spent on average 25% of their income on food. But by 1973, this had been lowered to 13%. This was the golden age of cheap food. After decades of development, that initial policy goal appeared to have been achieved, and the world was changing.
Sit down, breakfast with Tony. It's the see-through cooking oil.
Campbell's soups. Try chicken with rice.
In the 1960s and 70s, Washington's primary focus was no longer to supply stable and affordable food. Instead, the focus shifted to maximize output and efficiency, with the goal to become a global agricultural exporter. Small farms consolidated into large firms, and they realized that there was much more value further down the supply chain. Instead of producing corn, they started producing sweeteners. Instead of growing wheat, they marketed cereals. Raw crops became inputs, and food became more distanced from the farm. In 1950, 40% of every food dollar went to the farm. The rest was split across processing, transport, retail, and services. Today, that picture has flipped. The farm share shrank to 11%. Today, the United States is the largest agricultural exporter by a wide margin. They produce roughly $500 billion per year between 2.5 million people. That's similar to India's output, but with 100 times fewer people. So, with so much control over the market, why do they struggle to control prices? American farms have made enormous productivity gains. Since 1970, the production of beef has increased by 15%, while the number of cows has decreased by a third. Cattle farmers now have better access to food for their cows, genetics have improved, and veterinary care has become more effective. US wheat farmers, similarly, increased their yields from 30 bushels per acre in 1970 to over 45 bushels in 2022. That's a 50% productivity increase on the same plot of land. Such gains are seen across sectors. In 1970, one chicken yielded on average 3.5 pounds of meat. That is now up to 6 pounds. Those productivity gains were achieved by fundamentally uprooting the American food system, and that same system is now responsible for higher prices that are difficult to control. The new philosophy in Washington, starting in the 1970s, was to prioritize output above everything else. Over time, this led to fewer, larger players dominating key parts of the system. Today, in beef processing, just 4 firms control 85% of the business. In corn seeds, just 2 companies control 72% of the industry. So the problem with this is that it creates very little competitive pressure. So when the production costs then fall again, the prices don't always follow. And eggs are a good example. Since 2020, prices have been extremely volatile, peaking at over $6 in early 2025. The main trigger was a massive bird flu outbreak, which forced farmers to cull tens of millions of chickens, cutting supply almost overnight. But even as supply conditions began to stabilize, prices remained elevated. There are many benefits of having a more consolidated system, and the biggest one is efficiency. But it also is very susceptible to shocks. When such disruptions hit, like in this case the bird flu, it moves very quickly through the system, and this pushes up the price. But the other way around, when the shock passes, the production costs can lower again, but these companies don't have a lot of competitive pressure to aggressively lower their prices. While Americans paid record prices for eggs, some of the largest egg producers in the country reported record profits. And it's tempting to point at corporate greed, and that's certainly a part of it, but firms respond to incentives. Washington incentivized creating abundance. Supermarket chains in the 1990s and early 2000s began expanding, and the whole profit model of the system shifted away from the farm. On farms, raw inputs are produced and exported to be processed. There's value added with packaging and branding, where tremendous profits are made. So one of the things that I keep thinking about are these yogurts. My kids, they absolutely love these things, and they never ask for a yogurt. They always ask for, can I have a Bluey, which is that little character that's on the top there. So there's very little yogurt in this packaging, but the real value is the branding and the entire marketing machine behind it. And such value-added layers today dominate the American food system. Value is added through transport, warehousing, and advertising. Retail takes a cut, and food services. All these steps add costs before it reaches you, the consumer. Americans may spend over $2.5 trillion annually on food, but you're no longer paying a substantial part to a farmer. Only 11 cents of every dollar you spend goes to a farmer. The other 89% goes to what the government calls marketing. This can be further subdivided, and the largest category is by far food services. This includes restaurants, catering, and takeout foods. Another substantial share goes to processing the food that you eat, and to trade. This is a major category, and the value that you get here is that the food is found at stores near you, year-round. This obviously looks different across different sectors, and some foods require more processing than others. And some foods, mainly fresh produce, are primarily imported. For example, eggs, beef, and milk all have a relatively high farm share, while more processed foods like cereals, sadly, bread, and soft drinks have a relatively low farm share. Bread is a good example. It is not very complex to produce. The key ingredients are wheat, water, salt, and some minerals, and these are for almost 100% sourced in the United States. But over the past 6 years, the cost of bread has increased substantially. That's not because the harvest of wheat had failed, or because there was a shortage of salt. The real driver of this price increase was that the process of turning grain into bread has become more expensive. Bread in the United States has a farm share that is just 8%. So when the price increases, it is most likely for everything that happens after the raw ingredients leave the farm. This price increase was driven by things like packaging, energy, and processing costs that have all been going up. Similarly, beef production has been stable, as it has been for many decades. But over the last couple of years, prices have risen substantially, and the same is true for chicken meat. The underlying reasons are similar. These sectors, like the economy as a whole, has been dealing with increased energy costs, labor costs, and industrial costs. That is the real shortcoming of this system. The world these past 6 years has lived through extreme shocks. The supply shocks during the pandemic and the energy shocks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the US-Israeli attack on Iran. This raises costs across the board, and because of how the American food system is now structured, this quickly drove up prices, and it took longer for them to go back. One of the results is that an increasing number of households is now food insecure. 14% in 2024. That equals 1 in every 7 households. So I've now spent most of the video talking about the system behind these rising prices, but that is only half of the full picture. The other half is wages. Affordability always comes down to the same thing. How much have prices increased versus how much wages have increased over that same time? You now know that the American food system started taking its current form after policy shifts in the early 1970s. But around that same time, something else happened. This is America's productivity over time. It steadily increased, but following the oil shocks in the 1970s, there was a noticeable dip. It picked up again from the 1980s and onwards, but now look at this. This is America's median wage growth, and until the 1970s, it developed a long productivity growth, but it diverted. Today, there's a massive gap between long-term productivity growth and long-term wage growth. So this graph to me tells a lot of stories. It doesn't just show how income inequality has been sustained and created structurally over the last couple of decades, but the problem is that affordability wasn't maintained by rising wages, but by cutting costs. And those profits that resulted from this more efficient system weren't then equally shared amongst the people. These videos are really fun to produce, but they also take a lot of time and effort to research and to edit and all of those things that come with it. But here's a problem that we're facing with YouTube right now. Let me show you this. These are the search trends for the term YouTube automation. And what you can see here around May 2025, there's a sudden spike. And the highest recorded search volume so far was the last complete month, which was March 2026. And this really hurts creators like us because the YouTube algorithm isn't really good at distinguishing between AI slop and creators like me, which is hopefully less sloppy. And what I can see from our YouTube analytics is that most of you watching this right now are not subscribed to the channel. If you want to support creators like me, and if this is the kind of content that you want to see more of, the best way that you can do that is by liking this video, by subscribing to the channel, by turning all notifications on. That way, it's more likely that you're going to be suggested this type of content, including my content, and that also helps me stay in business and produce more of it. I appreciate that you stuck around all the way towards the end of this video, and if you want to see more, here are 2 more videos that you can consider for your next watch.